Hey everybody, Adam here with WhipWorks, and this is the WhipWorks How to Make a Bullwhip series, where I show you how to make a professional quality paracord bullwhip. For the overlay of our bullwhip, we're going to need our paracord in whatever colors you want to use. I'm going to be using International Orange and Caribbean. And you're also going to need some neoprene rubber. Now, well, I use neoprene rubber. I've also used scraps of leather in the past. This neoprene rubber is 1/8 inch thick. On the heel of the whip, I have this measured to 1 3/16 wide. And on the mid knot, or the transition of the whip, I have a strip that is 1/2 inch wide. But I'm sure that a piece of scrap leather wrapped once or twice around at those same thicknesses will work just fine for you. And a concho. The Celtic concho I'm using in this project is 1 inch in diameter. You can use 1 1/16 inch diameter conchos, and if you have a 1 1/8 inch concho, you can make it work, but it's not preferable. So with all of that in mind, let's get started plaiting. Woo! To the overlay of this whip. For this whip, we're gonna be using International Orange and Caribbean. Now, I've never made a whip of these colors, but I want two highly contrasting colors so you can see better what I'm doing with my hands here. So we need our 16 plat layer. Looking at the blueprint, we need two at 54, 64, 77, 89, 102, 113, and 123. So I'm gonna get trimming. So all of our paracord is cut to length, and now we're gonna start, just like we did with the 6 plat and the 10 plat layer, with a strip of vinyl tape. So I'm gonna go with, this one's gonna be longer than our last ones. I'll probably go like, I don't know, what is that, like almost 6 inches here. Give that a trim. And we're gonna set it down. And we need enough for 16 strands to fit across this. And the way that I do my whips, pretty much all of my whips are all of one color on one side and all of one color on the other side. So now, this may not make a ton of sense now, but I'm gonna say this. Whichever strand you want to eventually be your right facing strand of whatever pattern you're doing, that strand color needs to be on the right side. So if eventually you want the pattern to lay like this, where the orange is going this way and the blue is going this way, then the orange paracord needs to be on the right side. Okay, so it's kind of gonna look a little opposite to what it's going to be when this gets wrapped around the whip. And hopefully it makes more sense as we keep going here. So just like before, being very careful. This is where the paracord can get really fussy with not sticking to this vinyl tape here. And again, because we cut 1 or 2, because for this longest strand it was 123 inches and we needed 4 of them, because all 4 of those strands need to be the same length because they're all going to be in the hitch knot, which I'll go over later. But anyways, because we cut the same amount of each length piece of paracord, we cut 1 or 2 of blue and 1 or 2 of orange of each of those. Wow, that was a horrible sentence. But you know what I'm saying. We just know that if we get all of one color on the right side and all of one color on the left side, that we have laid it out correctly. Oh, lost one. See, this is what happens. Okay, so we're gonna have to get creative here, okay? And we'll do that trick that I showed you earlier because it's gonna work here. Now what I may do, I'm going to do these a little bit out of order because it's not sticking very well. So I'm gonna take my last blue strand, or my last 2 blue strands, and it doesn't matter what order these go on, but I'm gonna take my last 2 blue strands Come on, behave. Nice. And then I'll go on ahead and make sure that those are, for the most part, locked in place. And again, this is one of the nice things about having a two-toned whip is, so long as each half is a different color, you know that you're placing them in the correct position. Ooh, and I cut this vinyl tape to the perfect length. All you need is for there to be a little bit of overlap here of vinyl tape. If I cut it too short and there was a gap here, I would just take another little strip and lay it over the top here. But we don't need to do that. So now I'm gonna place these. 1, 1, 2, 3 block is not enough to get this entire thing covered. I mean, it barely is, but not enough for the amount of pressure we're gonna be putting on it. So I use 2 1, 2, 3 blocks, one on the right 8 strands, one on the left 8 strands, and again, we're lining it up with the edge of the table, lining the vinyl tape up with the edge of the table. And using my vice grips, getting it nice and firmly in place. Okay, and now we're doing that same diamond pattern to get things started. So we're gonna take our right and we're gonna go over, and then we're gonna go, sorry, I kind of got ahead of myself there. Then we're gonna take that next blue strand, gonna go over, next orange strand, under, over. I hope this brighter paracord is easier for you to see than the black paracord. I just really like using the black paracord for my cores. And then we're gonna take our next international orange, over, under, over. Our next Caribbean, over, under, over. And I like to keep this kind of nice and formed so I can see it, especially as you're starting. If you kind of reshape it after every plait, you'll be able to better visualize where the next strand needs to go. So we'll go under, over. Eventually you can do this without even looking, it's just by feel. You see this nice kind of, this weave that we start here. And this will hold its shape nicely for us when we go to put it, to wrap it around our 10 plait, our completed 10 plait layer. Okay, here we go. Here's our overlay. Okay, here we go. You see this nice shape? Give all of these a nice little tug, kind of get it nice and tight here. You want a nice straight line. So now we're gonna take our vices off and have I'm gonna have my 10 plait layer standing by, ready to go. Or my whip rather. And I'm gonna trim a piece of vinyl tape and set it aside so that I have it ready to go. You know, couple inches, 2.5 inches or so. I'm gonna take this off, take this tape, and it's gonna go around, it's gonna get taped right there. And this is going to wrap around this 10 plait layer here, so. And set that 10 plait layer there. About halfway into the vinyl tape, I'm gonna take this, wrap it around, and wrap it around, and tape it up. Now be sure to keep, it's gonna get really messy on you here. Just be sure to keep all of the blue strands on one side, or keep your strands all going in the same direction. So now, if you've done everything that I've done so far, your first strand is going to be this orange strand. I know that because this orange strand is going over this blue strand. Whereas we can't start with this blue strand, or at least the way that I like to do things, I don't want to start with this blue strand because if I start with the blue strand, then this orange strand is going to have to go under this new blue strand in order to keep the over-under pattern. So I'm going to start with this orange strand, and it's going over that last blue strand that goes the opposite direction, or I don't know, this last blue strand that we've already worked with, if that makes sense. And then I'm tugging this through. Like to keep my strands nice and organized here. Now we're going to take our blue strand, and it's going to go over. Now this blue strand is going to get pulled out. Now next is our next orange strand, and it's just going to go over one. And I'll place my thumb on it and pull this orange strand out of the way. Be really gentle here, because these strands, as you're pulling them, if you pull them too fast, they can get caught on other strands and then they get all jumbled and it turns into a total mess. So just be nice and gentle here. So next is this Caribbean strand. And it's gonna go, if you can see this here, we got these two orange strands, so it's gonna go under, over, like that. There we go. And this next orange strand, we're gonna go under, over. And now this blue strand, which is going to go over, under, over. See that? Nice. All right. This next spot is where it gets a little complicated. When my right facing strand has 3 strands to go over, this is where I like to start whatever plaiting pattern that I'm doing for the whip. In this case, I'm doing a vertical strip pattern, which in its essence is just an under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2 pattern. We're gonna do that for our handles. I think it's a great beginner pattern, and I think it's like the perfect, it always looks great, and I think it's a great first handle pattern to work with, but you can do whatever handle pattern you want. I've also provided a vertical strip handle pattern design for you to look at. So I recommend you go back to that Google Drive folder that I had the 6-foot blueprint in, and you can also download that vertical strip handle pattern for free. So if you look at it, you'll see that I do the diamond pattern up to a certain point, and then I start my over 2, under 2 pattern for the vertical strip. So there's gonna be like a line where it starts all the way around, which is kind of confusing because on this back side, you'll see we have this diamond pattern, which is going lower than I want it to be vertical strip from here all the way down. So here's where my method gets a little complicated. I'm gonna undo these plaits as I go and convert them into the under 2, over 2. So bear with me here as we get started. So this is kind of that line where it's gonna stop being the diamond pattern, and this cord is gonna go under 2, over 2. And that's our first little section of the vertical strip. And you'll start to be able to visualize it better as we go. Okay, next up, we'll do like these 5 strands will be in our vertical strip pattern. And I know that my last 2 are going to be over. This blue strand is gonna go over these 2. So that means it's gonna go under these 2, and it needs to go over this one. So it's gonna go over, under 2, over 2. Okay. Next up. And it's still cooperating. Or no, now we have to start undoing plaits, because this is kind of our imaginary line. So it's not doing what I want it to do. I want it to go over this strand, not under it. So I have to pull the strand out very gentle here. See, it's getting kind of bunched up here. So I'm just gonna kind of gently tug it so that it doesn't undo all of the work that I've done so far. And sometimes knots will get formed and you just kind of go with the flow. So I don't mind if it goes over this strand. Within the over 2, under 2 pattern, it would go under this strand, but that's okay. I'm gonna go over it. So I'm actually gonna go over 3, under 2, over 2. I hope this isn't like totally making your brain explode. It's just, I thought I'd show you my method. This is how I do it. And hopefully it makes sense to you. I swear, this is one of the more complicated parts. We're getting there. Once we're done with this part, we get into just the best part of making whips, which is just the general plaiting. Okay, so is this one cooperating? We want to go, here's our kind of line here. We're going to go over these 2, under these 2, over these 2. No, it's not quite cooperating, so we have to undo it here. And I'm actually going to undo it back a ways. I'm going to undo it all the way back here. And now this strand is actually going to be a complete pattern. So it's going to go under 2 because this one is cooperating. So we're going under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. Then I'll kind of get it back in position here. And then I'll get these, make sure these strands all stay in order. Okay. We're getting there. We're getting there, gang. Just a few more strands. Okay, next up. Now we're going to start undoing them all the way before we plait them. So I'm going to undo this next strand, and it's going to go over 2, under 2, over. No. What happened? Sorry. See, I'm already messing up. It's under 2 to start with, not over 2. So it needs to go under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. Oh boy, I'm getting a little disorganized here. I'm going to reestablish my strands here so that they don't get too messy on me. Okay, next. I'm going to grab this strand and it's going to go. First I'm going to undo it so it's easier to work with. We're going to go over 2, under 2. Nope. Over that, and then it goes under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. Next up, under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. Two more, and then we can get this thing in the vise. Under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. I hope that now you can really see it getting started here. See that pattern. Oh, I lied. We got one more after this. So we're going to go over 2, under 2, over 2. And last strand before we get this in the vise. Oh, also, note here, I should have said this earlier. Do not pull too hard during this. Don't pull super hard during this section because the only thing that's holding these all in place is this vinyl tape here. So just kind of gentle tugging here. I'm being very gentle. We'll give it a hard pull in a second here after we get the artificial sinew binding it. And then we'll go over 2. So it's going under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. And then Boom. And there you have it. That's the beginning of our pattern. Okay, let's get our vise out and get this thing in the vise. And here we go, the big moment. This is where whip making gets really fun. We're gonna start plaiting. All right, we're gonna start really plaiting though. We're gonna start plaiting the overlay. So I've got my starting pattern here, my beginning of the whip, and I'm gonna get in the vise. I gotta scoot this chair back here. Okay, get all my strands on one side, or get my strands on the correct side of me here. All right, so I like to get up to that vinyl tape line, just like with my 10 and my 6 plat layers. And I'm gonna get this in here really tight. And making sure that I get a nice straight line with this so that I can keep it nice and straight while I'm plaiting. We want a good start here. Okay, grab my artificial sinew. Get a loop started. You've seen me do this. You don't have to do this step with the 10 and the 6 plat layer because it's thin enough, it kind of holds itself in place, but we're gonna really tug tight on this layer, so we really need to get this do this layer of binding so that none of the strands come undone, because that's a pain to fix. Not that I would know from experience, I've never had to do that, but whatever. So here we go, we're gonna wrap this up. And once we got a couple wraps around, we have a really, really tight tug. And we don't need to go around this a ton, maybe like 8 to 10 roundabouts. Grab our string, just like we've done several times before. Wrap it around. This trick is this is like one of the best whip making tricks, is this self-binding trick here. Give it a trim. Open up a loop. Come on. There we go. Weave it in there. And tug it out. And trim away the excess. And now we can just plait. Under 2, and now you can give it a really nice tug here. Under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. Yes. And you'll know that the next strand that you need to plait in this pattern is always the opposite strand of the strand that is currently going over the furthest down the pattern. So right now, this orange strip is the last strand to go over. So we're gonna take our back blue strand now, and we're gonna go under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. Keeping this line. Now you can keep going. Now we're only going to take this pattern up to the end of the handle. And then we're gonna transfer into our herringbone pattern. So I'm gonna plait a couple inches further up here and then reconnect with you, because we're gonna have to do a little trick here. All right, so we've plaited down several inches now, and this pattern is really firmly in place. And now I need to do a little trick. So I need to know exactly where the metal of our handle ends. Where does the steel rod end? Well, I know that the steel rod is 10 inches long. So I'm gonna take this Glover's needle. Now this is a number 3 Glover's needle. It's very fine there. And they're used in leatherworking, but I find that these are the perfect size for what I'm gonna do. So I put them in a pair of pliers here, and I'm going to poke it. I'm gonna go into this diamond pattern, and I'm gonna poke it through the center, as much through the center as I can, and I'm gonna feel for that metal rod. This one went all the way through, and I can use my fingers to kind of tell if I had it centered. So that means that at this point, the metal rod is not there. Now I want to find out where the end of that metal rod is and get this Glover's needle in there as close to where the end of that metal rod is as possible. So I'll go down one more plat. So I was poking in this one, now I'm going to poke in this one, or I was poking in this one, now I'm going to poke in this one. There, I can feel it. The metal rod is in there. So I'll go up in between the two here. I'll go through this kind of awkward one here. And I feel the rod there. So I actually guessed it perfectly. This is where I'm going to put my Glover's needle. And then make sure I have it centered. So I know that the metal rod ends at this spot. This does two great things for us. The first thing it does is, when we're done with the whip, I know that this is where I'm gonna trim off this excess material at the end. I call it the whipple, or the whip nipple. Tee. Tee. I watched Bridgerton recently, so ooh, the whipple. The second thing that it does for us, Bridgerton references aside, is we can use it with our ruler to measure and find out how far down the handle we need to plait our vertical strip pattern before we need to switch into our under 4 over 4 herringbone pattern. So I'm gonna keep plaiting down the handle, checking it as I go with my ruler to make sure I don't go past that 10-inch mark where we need to convert into our under 4 over 4 herringbone pattern. So I'll catch back up with you in a second here. So I've plaited down, and if I line up my ruler with that needle at the back, and I measure down, you can see here that this most recent plait is right at the 10-inch mark. And for the under 4, or for the vertical strip pattern, that's where we want to transfer into our herringbone. Now, just a little bit of whip science here. Eventually, we're going to be wrapping this 1/2-inch bolster around the whip, and the entirety of this bolster needs to be below, at or below, where that transition from the steel rod into the thong is. I used to think that you wanted it to be like this, where it was right in the middle, but really you want it to be all the way below. Because if you put it at the middle, eventually this can kind of wiggle and it can stretch the paracord and it looks really awful. So you need it to be all the way below, completely on the transition, or completely on the steel rod, if that makes sense. So with our vertical strip pattern, if we look at that pattern I provided for you, that means that we actually need to convert into our under 4 over 4 pattern just below that 10-inch mark. But because of how the vertical strip pattern is patterned, it's actually already under 4. These strands are already in the under 4 over 4 pattern from this point down. So our next strand, according to our overlay pattern, or according to our vertical strip blueprint here, is going to go under 2 over 2, just like vertical strip. Now we're gonna deviate and we're gonna go under 1 over 3. So now we've established this is kind of our imaginary line where from here over, we're now in our herringbone pattern. And that spot is at just below 10 inches, which is exactly where we want it. So that's perfect. Now our next one of our right facing strands, it's gonna go under 2 over 6. Under 2 over 6. Okay. Then our next left facing strand, under 2 over 1, under 1 over 4. Now, we are already in our under 4/4 pattern. You don't have to do anything else now. It's just those 3 tricky strands, and we're already in our under 4/4 pattern. Oh, and this is where it's like knitting, or I don't know, just any kind of cathartic, repetitive process. It's just under 4/4. This is the whip maker's dream. You can just zone out and plait. So according to our 6-footer blueprint, we will drop from 16 plait to 14 plait at 23 inches. So I'm just gonna keep plaiting here, under 4/4. You'll notice here, I'll try and give you a little tip. I like to hold it down with the thumb of the hand that I'm not stretching with or tightening with. So I'll tighten this strand. So at any given point, I always have a thumb at this point to keep it in place. And then I like to kind of follow the groove and plait it around. See, now I'm holding it with a thumb. Now I'm switching thumbs, tightening, switching thumbs, snagging, going around, switching thumbs. So I always have a thumb on that spot. You can see a little bit of a bulge here, and that's because this is at its thickest point because we've bolstered that transition so many times. So that's okay. Most of that will get covered up by our accent knot. But if it's really bad, you've got a little bit of wiggle room. You can kind of, with your nail, just kind of massage these strands into the position you want them in. And you'll just keep plaiting. Always keeping a thumb on that most recent strand. And you don't need to do that. You can plait a little bit more loosely, but this is how I find I can keep an even tension throughout the whip. Also, as we're plaiting, really watch this line. This line that goes all the way throughout the whip here. You want to keep that as straight as possible, even as you're dropping strands, which can be really difficult to do, but it's what makes the difference between a mediocre whip and a great whip, is not having that twist in the plaiting. You just want it to be straight down the entire thong of the whip. So I've plaited down just a little bit here, and I'm ready to move it up in the vise. I always like to vise this section here, right at that transition. It's just a good time to a good place to put the whip in the vise. So notice I've plaited down quite a bit past that transition spot, even though I knew that I wanted to put this spot in the vise. So when you put the whip in the vise, you don't want to put it too close to where you're plaiting, because when you tighten strands, so let's say I tighten this orange strand, I'm not just tightening this section, I'm also tightening this section up here, and maybe this section up here just a little bit. So if it's in the vise, I keep it from tightening itself because it's being clamped in by the vise and being held in place. So I want to be sure that I keep enough of the material outside of the vise that when I tighten, when I plait, I have enough room for all of this material to benefit from the tension that I'm giving it. So I'm about to drop my first strands, and I wanted to show you something. If you can see here where we have that bulge and where we have a little bit of a gap here, you can see that there's more of a gap showing between the orange strands than there is between the blue strands. That means that this Caribbean paracord is ever so slightly thicker than this international orange paracord, which means that we're going to strop a Caribbean strand before we drop the international orange strand whenever we drop a strand, because it'll even out whenever we're at 15 plat or we're at 11 plat. We'll have more international orange strands. We'll have one more international orange strand than Caribbean strands, so it'll even out and it'll help us keep our whip nice and straight. I hope that makes sense. Now, if we measure our whip, and we can use that Glover's needle, if we measure our whip down, we'll see here I'm at just past 22 inches. And it says on our blueprint that we need to start dropping strands at 23 inches. Well, in order to drop strands, I need the shortest strand to be at the bottom. So if I plait an entire another 8 strands down until this strand is at the bottom again, I'm gonna be at like the 24-inch mark, and I'd rather drop it with a 6-footer. I'd rather drop it a little bit earlier than a little bit later. So that's just a taste thing though. So now we're going to drop this shortest blue strand. And like I just showed you, we know that our Caribbean paracord is just a little bit thicker than this international orange paracord. So I'm always gonna drop that Caribbean first. And then I'm gonna plait over it. And eventually, I'm gonna continue with this, or I'm gonna continue here with this under 4/4 pattern. And when we get to the spot coming up here, these orange strands are gonna switch to an under 4/3 pattern, while this Caribbean will continue at an under 4/4 for just a little bit. Here's where our dropped strand is, right? So if we were to continue with the under 4/4, this next orange strand would go under that shortest strand and over 4. But we're dropping it. So that strand needs to kind of disappear, let it dangle below, and this orange strand is going to go under 4, going over that dropped strand over 3. And that Caribbean strand, this Caribbean strand here, is now a part of the body of our whip, or of the core of our whip, if you will. And now I am going to drop this next international orange strand here once we get there. Okay, so if you see here, when I tug on this strand, you'll see that that dropped strand is kind of sticking out a little bit because we haven't tightened it. So before I plait this next blue strand here, I'm gonna take that dropped strand and I'm gonna pull it to the side and give that a nice snug pull, and then I'll gently lay it. And now I'm gonna keep it plaited there. There we go. And I'm gonna tighten this up a bit because now I'm already going to drop that next orange strand. Actually, you know what? I lied. I'm gonna go one more loop here, and then I'm gonna drop this orange strand. So I'll go down 15 more plaits, and then we'll drop this orange strand. So now this orange strand is at the bottom again. So essentially we did 2 passes past our dropped blue strand with our orange until we're now dropping this orange strand. Before I plait over it, I need to show you something. I'll zoom this out. Okay. So I know that we're now in our 14 plat section. So the next drop is going to go into our 12 plat section. And I know that I'm going to start dropping strands from 14 to 12 plat, according to our blueprint, at the 31-inch mark. So I'm going to measure down to 31 inches along the body of the whip here. And I have this neat little trick that I do. So I have an old lacing needle that I don't use anymore, except for this, so I actually use it quite a bit. And I have a piece of white paracord attached to it here, so you can just see, and I just always keep this white paracord on it. So I'm gonna measure down the length of the body of the whip here to that 31-inch mark. So we can see here, here's that 31-inch mark, and now I'm gonna take that lacing needle, and just on one of these outside plats of the 10 plat layer, I'm gonna mark it. And there we go. Now I can remove this, and I always know that this is where I'm gonna be dropping from 14 plat to 12 plat. It's just a nice little reference. But first I need to drop this orange strand. So I'm gonna keep plaiting here, and things are actually gonna get tricky here in a second. So I know I'm throwing another advanced whip making technique at you rather than just making a simple whip. This is not a simple whip. This is the whip that I send to my clients. So hopefully this is, you know, kind of showing you how to make a good quality whip here. Keep an eye out for when you're switching from that under 4/4 pattern to the under 4/3 pattern. And we are going to go under 4/3 on both sides. Now here's where this gets a little bit different than with my 10 plat layer. Remember I told you that with the 10 plat layer, I trim the dropped strands differently. So I'm going to keep these two strands into the overlay of into the 12 plat section. So at any given time along the body of the whip, I have 2 dropped strands in the body of the whip instead of just 1 dropped strand, as I do with the 10 plat layer. This keeps a more even flow to the whip, I think, rather than having little bulges where it goes from 2 additional strands, dropped strands, to 1 additional dropped strand, and back and forth. So that's just a taste thing though. So anyways, all that to say, I am not going to trim either of these until we get into the 12 plat section. So I'm at this point here where the next orange strand I pull on, I can tell is underneath that dropped strand. So I'm going to take that dropped strand, give it a nice tug, and then keep plaiting. Remember I told you that things were going to get a little complicated? Here's where it gets complicated. I have here a whip that I made years ago. And if you'll notice, let me see if I can find it. You see here, there's a spot here where this black strand is going over 2 green strands, when it should just go over 1 there. What on earth is that? It looks like a horrible mistake. Well, this more difficult technique that I'm about to show you keeps that from happening. And instead, you get to keep this pattern all the way through the body of the whip, and you don't see those over 2 kinks like you see right here. Here's another way of describing it, and let's see if this makes sense. So right now we're plaiting in an under 4/3 pattern for our 14 plat section, right? So if I dropped strands as I've been dropping strands up until now, I'm going to drop the bottommost strand, and then I'm gonna find that once that strand disappears into the body of the whip, I'm plaiting at under 4/2, and that is very uneven and it doesn't work. So I need to somehow get to an under 3/3 pattern from this under 3/4 pattern, or under 4/3 pattern, without having any of those double kinks that I showed you in that green and black whip. And the way that we do that is we flip it. We're going to flip the whip over so that it goes from an under 4/3 pattern to an under 3/4 pattern, which means then that we can transition into an under 3/3 pattern. This doesn't make sense. It did not make sense to me when I first learned this. So let's see if we can visualize it as we go. So the first thing I need to do is tighten all of these strands up to prepare it for a flip. So I'm going to get these nice and in position here so that they don't get super deformed when we flip the whip over. And again, this is right now an under 3/4 pattern, but we're going to change that. Then I like to take these clips that I have, these big like paper clip things, and I'm going to snag all of those. Snag all of those, and I'm going to give it a flip. So I'm going to undo the vise, flip it 180 degrees, and back in the vise. All right. Now very gently, I need to get my strands to their correct side now, because now it was opposite. What was our right-facing strand is now our left-facing strand, and vice versa. So now you'll see this is unfamiliar. What is this? This doesn't look anything like what you've seen before. So we have to fix this. Okay. So first, you'll see if I take this back orange strand, it wants to go over 4, which is in line with our under 3/4 pattern that we are now establishing. So I'll get that over, hold it down with my thumb, and then I'll undo this clip. And then I'm going to go over 4 with that next back strand. Shush! Then I'm going to go with that next back strand. There's four strands waiting for it to be placed over. So I'm gonna make that happen. And then the next Caribbean strand is gonna go over 4. The next international orange strand, over 4. And still one more Caribbean strand wants to go over 4. Now it's a little messy. This one wants to go under 1/4, but it just doesn't look great. So what I like to do at this point is from the back, I'm gonna get these 3 international orange strands and I'm gonna put them in their correct orientation. And then I'm gonna take these back 3 Caribbean strands and I'm gonna put them in their correct orientation. And then I'm gonna make sure all of our strands are where they need to be. And we've done it. We are now working with an under 3/4 pattern. How cool is that? Now when we drop to our 12 plat layer, we can go directly from an under 3/4 to an under 3/3, and it's gonna stay nice and even, and we're not gonna have any of those kinks. And we have this section marked here for when we're gonna drop to our 12 plat. So it's pretty easy to follow. I see here that the next time that this Caribbean strand gets into the front of the plaiting pattern, that's going to be a good spot to drop this Caribbean strand. Now, instead of measuring from the heel to mark our next spot, to mark where we're going to drop to 10 plat, what I like to do is just, since I know that this is that 31-inch mark where we're going to switch to the 12 plat section, I like to take my ruler, measure down to 8 inches below there to that 30. Now I know this is our 39-inch mark where I know I'm going to drop from 12 to 10 plat. And I'm going to take a little clip here and I'm going to mark it. Boom. And now I know that that is my 39-inch mark, and that's where I'm going to drop from 12 to 10 plat. But we still need to drop from 14 to 12 here real quick. So I'm going to complete this cycle here until the Caribbean strand is in front. I've plaited down to that shortest strand of the Caribbean side, and now it's time to go to our 12 plait. So like I said earlier, it's going to be going from a under 3/4 to an under 3/3. So I'm just going to keep plaiting here, under 3/4, knowing that this strand, which is right here, is being dropped. So I'll let that strand dangle while I keep plaiting down. So you'll notice here I have 3 strands now, 3 additional strands underneath our overlay. And there's 2 on this side, and they can get a little bunched over here. It can get a little bulgy. So what I like to do here for this short portion before we trim this strand short, I like to keep it underneath that most recently dropped strand. Not underneath like this, not like this, if you can see that, or like this, but underneath like this. So it kind of lays like this. Okay, and like we've seen before, this next strand, when I tug on it, you can see that this strand is bulging out just a little bit. So now I'm gonna take that dropped strand and give it a nice tug, and then get it back in position over the top of that orange strand, and keep plaiting. So this was our dropped strand, and so past the strand that we dropped, I like to go like maybe 2 inches before we drop, or before we trim that prior strand. And everything we're doing here is to encourage a nice taper. All right, so here's that shortest strand. This is the next one we're gonna drop. And I'm gonna go one more round here before we drop that strand. So we've done one more round, and here's that shortest orange strand, and we're gonna drop that strand. And again, I'm gonna lay this orange strand kind of over the top of this blue strand along the side here, so that they lay kind of nice and flat rather than being bunched up on each other like this, because that can create a bulge. So I'm going to keep it like this. Give that strand a tug. Lining everything up like we did with the blue side. Oops. And now I'm going to give this previous Caribbean strand a trim. Encourage that taper. And there we go. We are comfortably in our under 3/3 pattern now. Now the beauty about this 12 plait section is we don't need to do the flip that we did from the 14 plait to 12 plait. We can just continue this under 3/3 down. We can just go from under 3/3 to under 3/2, and we're not going to have any of those kinks. But we will have to flip the 10 plait side when we go from 10 plait to 8 plait. But we'll get there. Also, now we're getting into the section of the whip where we're plaiting over individual strands. We're no longer plaiting over a plaited section of whip, which means that everything underneath it is just a little bit more fussy. So you just have to be a little bit more, you have to pay a little bit more attention to what's going on in the body or underneath the overlay to kind of keep everything together. All right, so our shortest Caribbean strand is right here, and we're dropping down to 10 plat right here. So I know that I'm gonna do one more round and then I'm gonna drop this blue strand. And I'm gonna do like we did before. I'm gonna take my ruler, I'm gonna measure down 8 inches along that sinker cord and mark it. And now I know that I will drop from 10 plat to 8 plat at this point. But first I need to do plat one more round here so that I can start dropping from 12 plat to 10 plat. Those little tricks are just, that's just a thing that I do so that I can kind of keep ahead or think ahead rather, and just keep going. You don't want to stop plaiting to do, to measure from the heel all the way down. It takes time, you have sat down to work on a whip. All right, so that shortest blue strand is now here. It's a good place to drop. This is a good spot to give all of these under strands a little tug. I'm gonna do this periodically throughout the whip. Since it's not plaited or bound, we need to make sure that it's keeping a nice shape as we're plaiting over it. And now we're gonna drop this blue strand, just like we've dropped our other strands. And actually, it's a little bit easier dropping strands when you're just plaiting over the loose strands, because you don't need to worry about it bulging with the other dropped strand. It just kind of blends in with the other loose strands. But one thing that's harder about it is you have to help it keep its form more. So it's just one more thing that your fingers kind of have to keep a hold of. Just like with all the plaiting we've done so far, always keeping a thumb at this point, but then when you're doing the loose strands, you also kind of have to keep everything together in the back as you move along here. So now this is my first strand that's going to go under 3 over 2. See how flawless, how seamless that transition is when you're going from under 3 over 3 to under 3 over 2. You can barely even tell that you've dropped a strand. One more here. All right, so when I tighten this next strand, you can see that this one up here is super loose. That's because that's the strand we just dropped. So I'm going to snag it from underneath, pull it to the side. Yeah, see how that snugged up everything above it too? Yeah, that was nice. That was nice. And we've gone far enough now that I'm going to trim one of these other previously dropped strands. At this point, it doesn't matter which one you drop, because there's not one that's like right next to the strand that we just dropped, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to go ahead and trim this shorter one. Get that down, get it at an angle. Cut it on the bias. So this was our latest dropped strand. This is how much further we have to go until we're going to convert into our 8 plat, into 8 plat. So I'm going to go on ahead and I'm going to drop it now because we have to flip it, because we got to flip it. So I want to leave plenty of room for me to navigate for the flip. But this is, no, that's not true. I have this flip and then there's one more flip. We also have to flip the 6 plat to 4 plat transition, but that one's really easy. That one's a lot easier. We are under 3 over 2 now. We're getting pretty comfortably in there. And I'm going to trim this Caribbean strand now, because this is where that orange strand was dropped. So I'll trim it here, a couple inches. So we're pretty comfortably into our under 3/2 pattern now. We're far enough away from that dropped strand, and we've got a couple inches until we need to drop to our 8 plat. So now's a good time to prepare for the flip. So I'm going to move it up on the vise, but before I do that, every time before I move my whip further up on the vise, when I'm in this section of the whip, I give all of my strands a little tug. Even the sinker cord. Give it a little tug. Give a very gentle tug to my just dropped strands. I don't want to ruin this part here. I want to keep it, I don't want to make it stick out. There we go. Keep everything pretty uniform along the overlay. Now to do our favorite part, the flip. So like I did with that 14 plat section, I am giving all of these a nice tug. And then I'll take my clips. Now this one can get messy because all the strands underneath it are dangling about. So just keep your wits about you and we're gonna be just fine. So flipping it 180 degrees, getting it back in the vise. Keeping that straight line, taking my time here to make sure that I have that line that we've established, that we've worked so hard to keep. So now we're doing under 2/3. And I can see here that this blue strand wants to go over 1, 2, 3 orange strands. So I'm going to go ahead and let it do that. You can see this orange strand wants to go over 3. I'm going to do that. This blue strand wants to go over 3. This orange strand over 3. And this blue strand over 3. And now it's getting kind of messy. So I'll do that same thing I did with the 14 plat section. I'm going to go on ahead and get all of my strands facing the correct direction from the back. And now we've done it. We've established our under 2/3. Boom. And now we can just plait under 2/3 down to the spot where we're going to switch to 8 plat. All right, here's that next shortest blue strand, and this is where we convert. So I'm gonna do one more round of blue and then drop this. So I'm gonna do what we've done several times now. I'm gonna measure down 8 more inches. And now I know that this is my 55-inch mark, which is where I will eventually be dropping from 8 plat down to 6 plat. Okay, our shortest strand is in front, so we're gonna drop this Caribbean strand. And this is a good point to give everything a tug. And you see this black strand that I can just like barely see there? I still wanna give that a tug, so I'm gonna grab my pliers, or my needle nose here. Just gonna snag on. Give it a nice little tug. See, we got it out like a good extra centimeter there. And I'll give the sinker cord a tug as well. So now we're doing under 2/2 with our orange strands, and we're going under 2/3 with our blue strands. Don't forget that ever important step to give your dropped strand once you've gone down. Give that a nice tug. There we go. And then keep plaiting. And now I'm gonna go on ahead and drop this orange strand. So I'll just drop it. And now we're doing under 2 over 2 on each side. And just to point out, this is where that dropped blue strand was. This is that newly dropped strand. And we've got about 4 more inches there before we get to the 6-plat section. And we got to trim that last. Oh, I forgot to trim the orange. That's okay, not a big deal. Just so long as you keep a taper. So we'll trim that one as low as we can, and then we'll trim this one up here. So long as you're getting a taper, you don't need to be precise with it, you know? So I actually messed up there. I accidentally trimmed the wrong strand. That's okay, we're gonna keep going. I got distracted because I'm filming. Not a huge deal. We just roll with the punches. Since I messed up, I'm just gonna kind of even this out as best I can. So I'm gonna go ahead and trim this blue strand halfway between what's left and that next strand that's going to drop. Not a huge deal. All right, so here's our shortest blue strand, and here's where we're gonna be dropping to 6-plat. So I'm gonna do one more pass, and then I'm gonna drop that blue strand. Get that out of the way. Now, you'll notice I did not measure down another 8 inches because this next, the 6-plat into 5-plat section is, we're gonna be doing that a little bit differently, or at least there's some additional steps that we're going to do there. Because we are getting close to the end here, my friends. When you get to that 6-plat section, you can taste it. So we're gonna get down to under 2 over 1. And under 2 over 2 on this side. And I'm not going to be trimming any of the under strands here because I messed up earlier, so now we're already back on track from that little mistake I made. So I'm gonna tug this, get that nice and taut, nice and tight, tight like a tiger. So one thing that is specific to the 6-plat layer, the dropped strands of the 6-plat layer, I like to keep them laying flat on top, okay? So this is the only time that this really matters, but you'll see there's a step coming up here where this is gonna be helpful if you just prepare a little bit like I am here. So be sure to keep this blue strand on top, and when I drop this orange strand here, I'm also gonna have it lay on top. So here, let me plait down a little bit further, and I'll show you how I do that. Now, I'm going to drop this orange strand here, and like I said, we're gonna try and keep it on top of the sinker cord as much as possible. So, I mean, we're still plaiting over it. It's still a part of the core now, but I just want to keep those 2 strands above there. Orange strand a tug, nice, and laying on top. So here's our 2 dropped strands. They're on top of our sinker cord. And now I also need to trim this previously dropped strand. Now I have this strand here. So what I think I'm gonna do actually, what I'll do sometimes is I'll trim this. Instead of trimming this way back here, kind of in between this black strand, I'm gonna trim this back up here, a little bit past that black strand, and then I'm gonna shorten that black strand just a little bit. So now we have this nice taper, where, you know, it goes from there to there to there, kind of in thirds. Again, everything we're doing is just to encourage a good taper in our whip. So I'm going to plait up a little bit. And then we have to do our last flip, the final flip, to get from 6 plait to 5 plait to 4 plait. Though this flip is a lot easier than the other flips. Take my word for it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to give everything a good tug. And then I'll take some clips here. Flip it like so. Get that back in the vise nice and straight. Again, always encouraging that line. Nice and tight. Now instead of going under 2/1, we're going under 1/2. And now those 2 dropped strands should be directly underneath our sinker cord, which is what makes it helpful. And then this is our other underneath strand here. So these 2 are now underneath that sinker cord. But, so we're gonna go over, see that? This is the shape. This last one went over, so now I know that an orange strand needs to go over that. So that goes over 2. This blue strand goes over 2. This orange strand goes over 2, and then this blue strand goes over 2, and then I'll pull those last strands from behind. There we go, and now we have our shape. We have our under 1/2, which is exactly what we want. Boom. So there's a little bit of black paracord here poking through, if you can see that, my pointer finger there. So I'm just going to take my torch and very gently do that, and it just kind of retreats. And I'll go on ahead and shove it underneath here so that you can't see it. We've plaited down a little bit. We've dropped from 8 plait to 6 plait, and we've done the flip so that we're doing under 1/2 instead of under 2/1. We need to trim this sinker cord to be the exact length that we need it to be according to our blueprint. And according to our blueprint, we drop the sinker cord at 64.5 inches. So I'm going to grab my vinyl tape measure, and I'm going to go to the end here. And just like I've been measuring this entire time, I'm going to measure it from that needle that we poked into the heel of the whip earlier. And I'm just gonna run this along, run it along the body of the whip. Trying to kind of keep it as accurate as possible. I know that there's no way to do this perfectly, but we can try. 64.5 inches. Trim it. I like to do it just past that. Trim it just past that 64.5 inch mark. And then I'm going to take that tip that I cut at an angle, melt it a little bit, very gently flatten it, and then I'm going to trim away this excess black so that there's just a very thin melted portion of sinker cord there, so that you just want it not to fray, but you don't want it to be chunky. You know, I don't want there to be a bulge at this portion of the whip. This is kind of an awkward section of the whip, but this is one of the best ways that I have found to do this transition. So then we're going to keep plaiting down, and I know from my blueprint that I'm going to go from 6 plait to 5 plait about 1.5 inches up from this this chunk of sinker cord that we just melted. So I still, I'm at about 3 inches, and I still need to plait down a bit. At this section, I start to eyeball things a little bit more here, because it doesn't need to be so precise. Or at least the portions are small enough that I'm able to eyeball it. And again, I'm keeping those two final strands because for reasons you'll see very shortly, I like to keep them nice and underneath where this sinker cord is. Here's our shortest Caribbean strand. And I'm at about that 1.5 inch mark. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop down to 5 plait. So under 2 over 2. And I like to kind of take this strand and kind of place it at the top of that sinker cord there, keeping this curve. So it kind of goes chunk, chunk. Or not the curve, but bias maybe would be a better word. And I just keep going. There we go. And this is a good point to give this a good tug to the side. And then take that next strand. And there we go. Now, this is why I took so much time to make sure that those 2 extra strands were underneath it. So underneath our sinker cord, we have our 2 other dropped strands. One of them is on the outside, one of them is on the inside. I like to drop that inside strand, trim it at, about 1 centimeter away or more from the tip here, from the end of our sinker cord. So there we go. Now, you can't really see it now, but we go from that dropped cord is now, so that dropped strand now is sandwiched between this strand and our sinker cord so that it doesn't fray outside of our plaits at this kind of awkward transition from the 5 plait section, or from the 6 plait section into our 4 plait section. So now we're gonna plait our 5 plait about 1.5 inches past that sinker cord. And that sinker cord is nicely sandwiched between dropped strands. So hopefully none of that green sinker cord will show through in the little itty bitty sections where you can see the paracord that is underneath in this awkward section here. And when you roll this, it kind of hugs it together. So these gaps that you see here will get a lot less noticeable once you roll the whip. So here's that shortest international orange strand, and I'm gonna go ahead and drop it. I drop it like it's hot, drop it like it's hot, drop it like it's hot. Now I'm going to give it a tug here and then lay it on top. So just like we did with the strand up here where we wanted it to go chunk, chunk, now we want this orange strand to kind of go chunk, chunk. And we're gonna plait down just like maybe, I don't know, 1 inch here. Trim this strand now at about there. So this is where was our most recent drop, and I'll drop this, I'll trim this here. So we have 6 inches of 4 plat. So I am going to trim this orange strand here. Give both of these a tug, good little tug here. So I want to trim it at about 4 inches past the final dropped strand. So this is where that final drop was. So I'll go ahead and trim that orange strand. And again, just eyeballing it at this section. But I'm gonna do one last measurement here on our whip, because I need to figure out where I'm going to tie my hitch knot. And to do that, it needs to be pretty accurate, because we want it to be a 6-footer. We don't want it to be a 6-footer minus a couple inches, or 6-footer plus a couple inches, though I don't think anybody's mad if I don't think anybody gets mad if I send them a whip that's a couple inches longer than what they ordered. But they do get upset if it's a couple inches shorter. So now we got to do our last measurement. And we're going to measure from our needle. Measure down. Now 6 feet is 72 inches. And I could trim this core right at 72 inches. But here's the deal. When I wax my whips, as I'm going to do with this whip, the whip will shrink about an inch or more, depending on the length of the whip. So for a 6-footer, 5-footer, and 4-footer, I will add 1 inch to my 4-plat section, so that when the whip shrinks just a little bit, when I wax it, it doesn't get below 6 feet long. So I'm going to trim this at a bias at that 73-inch mark. And then, similar to what I did with the sinker cord, I'm going to burn this and then kind of pancake it here very lightly with my fingers. And then I'm going to trim it so that it doesn't bulge. And then I'm going to keep plaiting it down. That's where we're going to plait to. You're done plaiting. We're done plaiting. So next we're going to tie our hitch knot, but before we do that, we need to make a fall. So I'm going to show you real quickly how I make a fall. I do, on these whips, my falls are about 22 inches long. So to make that 22-inch long fall, I'm going to measure out of whatever color paracord you want your fall to be. I'm going to do Caribbean for this whip. I'm going to measure out 46 inches. Okay. And then I'm going to attach my lacing needle to it. So I burn it when it was at that angle there. And then I get something that looks like this. And I lace my lacing needle onto it like so. And then there we go. Now you want to make sure that there's no burrs here. You want to make sure this is smooth. If there's like a burnt, or if the hardened paracord is like poking out, it will catch itself in this next step that I'm going to show you. It'll make more sense in a second. But what you want to make sure that this is super smooth. If it's not smooth, you can maybe rescue it by taking your scissors and kind of trimming along the edge to make it a super smooth transition from the lacing needle to the paracord. But what you may need to do is detach it, trim it again, burn it again, and you'll kind of learn what that perfect shape is to make it fit the lacing needle. So now I'm going to measure from the lacing needle 20 inches down. So there's our 20-inch mark. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of fatten it up with my fingers here. Roll it so that it's tubular. And then I'm going to take my lacing needle, keeping this flat, 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 flat. Keep this flat shape as you loop it around. And then I'm going to lace this into itself. Here, that's a little better. And then I'll lace this into itself. Keeping that loop, you want to keep it flat, 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 all the way around there. And then we lace it into itself. Boom. And then you just kind of, like a snail, pull it through itself. And you want a loop about this size. You could go just a little bit smaller than that. Now be careful if you don't close it in on itself too much, or else it'll like eat itself and then you can't recover it. So be sure you keep a protruding loop at all times, but you want it about this size. And then what I do on this side is I take out the paracord, take off the lacing needle, trim off this burnt section at the bias, and then kind of pull it back over itself. There we go. And then I will trim this. You can feel where it's filled with itself. You find that end, and then I trim it about 2 inches above that. And then I melt it. And there you have it. Now we can tie our hitch knot. So here's our fall, and here is our hitch knot, or where we're going to have our hitch knot. So you're looking for a shape that looks about like this. You want it protruding about that much out of the bottom of the whip here. Now, this is a part where these little forceps are useful. So we need to get this fall onto the four-plat layer of the whip here. So I like to take these forceps, stick these kind of through there, and then I'll take the end of the two blue strands, stack them on top of each other, and I'll snag them with these, pull them through. There we go. And then I got to do the same with the other side. Give them a snag, pull them through. All right. And then I'll get this clip out of the way. And I just run this fall over all of it. There we go. So now it's up there, out of the way, and I need to get my four-plat section reestablished. Woo! Bumping the camera. And there we have that section of the core poking out underneath. Now I'm going to have the fall laying underneath it, and I'm going to take my top left facing strand and I'm going to go around and down. Okay. Okay, you see that? Now I'm not going to tighten it super tight here. I'm just going to keep it kind of loose. Now, I'm going to grab my orange strand that would have been the next strand in the plaiting. So you see it's this one. And I'm going to around and through. Let me do that again for you, okay? So right now it's laying flat with this blue strand. I'm going to go up, like kind of to the side like this, and around. And now it just kind of ties right underneath it, like that. Give it a little tug, but again, we're going to keep it loose for now, pretty decently loose for now. Now I like to grab my next blue strand, and that's just going to go around like that. Boom. Not too tight. So these are our three that we've already tied. So I'll take this last blue strand, or orange strand rather, and very similarly to what we did with this orange strand up here, it kind of needs to go like this. And then you kind of fold it like this. Now this last one, we can pull nice and tight. So I like to push up everything, and then keeping it there, I like to tighten it. You don't want to pull it, just pull it down, because then you'll loosen everything. You want to keep everything kind of pressed up. Yeah. So now I need to lace this underneath these three and underneath the loop of the fall. Okay, so that'll make more sense in a second here. So I'll do what we do to get our lacing needle on here. All right, that should be good. So I like to kind of find this groove here, kind of get it in there. And then we'll go through, and you want to kind of keep it all together here. Now we got to go under the orange here, like this. Be careful, make sure you're not like snagging the paracord anywhere. You want everything to just run smoothly and without resistance. If not, you can always backtrack. And then this last one here, just kind of fiddle it in there. Yes. Snug it through. And then get it through the fall there. Straighten it out. Boom. There you have it. The shape of the hitch knot now. We can tighten all of these, give them a good, again, kind of pushing up with this hand and pulling down with this hand. Yes, see how that's coming together there. Nice. And then we can give a tug up from the one that we just tied, and then we can pull down on the fall. Yes. Boom. Give everything a nice tug again. I'm getting excited. I'm bumping the camera. There we go. Now, we gotta make this. Gotta make this look nice. So I'm gonna trim this on a bias. Trim these on a bias. Kind of like to take all three and kind of do one of these numbers here. I think That looks kind of nice. And then we just melt it. We're gonna melt this spare material here. Awesome. Be careful when they're melted to make sure they don't touch each other, or else they'll kind of stick to one another. So you want to keep them separated. And I like to melt them just until they kind of seal themselves in there, if you can kind of see that. Don't want to melt them too much. Oh, and there you have it. Your completed hitch knot. Not half bad, right? Not half bad. So the next thing we need to do is we need to remove this whipple here at the end. Now we can't just trim this here or else all this material will fray. So we're going to take some artificial sinew and do what you've seen me do several times now. Tie a little knot here. And I'm going to wrap it up. Now I'm gonna wrap this up to about, I don't know, like anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to 1/8 of an inch away from the needle there. Get that on there nice and tight. That's actually a little bit too close there on that side, so there we go. That's too close on that side too. Okay. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Now the bolster that we're gonna put over this is 1 inch and 3/16 or less. So we only wanna go down to about here with this wrapping. So I'll go to there, grab my handy dandy Kevlar string. And just gonna keep wrapping down here. And that's good enough there. So we'll go ahead and trim it. Lace it through the eye. And pull it through. Whoops. Dropping stuff. There we go. Give it a trim. Now, we're going to trim it or cut this off right at that needle. There we go. Yeah, that's better. So we're going to cut it off right at that needle. So what I like to do is kind of do one kind of firm cut here, and then I'll remove the needle. And then trim the rest of it. This is where it really helps to have a brand new razor, really sharp. This one's pretty blunt here. There you go. Whipple's gone. Now we're going to burn this and shape it. Okay, so just go on one edge at a time. I'm gonna melt this down. And I take my 1, 2, 3 block and I kind of like that. Melt our next section. Try not to breathe in the fumes. probably gonna get like nylon paracord plastic poisoning from all the fumes I've breathed in over the years. And this is what really kind of locks it into itself here. Boom. And now we need to give it a roll, which I'm going to do off camera, and then we'll do our bolsters. Just gave our whip a roll. You can see it really comes together after you roll it. All of those gaps that were here at this transition spot are essentially gone. You've still got a little bit here because this orange paracord is thinner than the blue paracord, but it just looks pretty great. So now we need to get our bolsters on here, or our just this material, this neoprene rubber that I use in order to tie our knots around later. So I've already shaped this. You can see this neoprene rubber here. And you see how I've like shaved it at an angle on the sides? So I use this tool. It's a tool from Leatherworking. I cannot remember the name of it, and I did not keep the packaging. I'll try and find it though. Leave comments down below if you want me to try and figure out what this tool is called. But what I do with it is I take it here and I trim it along the edge, and I shape it so that it has an angle. So yeah, the neoprene rubber is a little difficult to work with, but you get the hang of it and it works really well. And it's very consistent, which leather can sometimes, depending on what leather you're getting, its thickness can vary, but this way it's always exactly the same. So here's how I do the mid knot. First, I'll eyeball, kind of setting it with my finger based on where we transitioned from our vertical strip to our herringbone pattern. And then I take my ruler. Let's see if you can see it here. The 10 is just past the heel. So I'll take my staple gun here. And my staple gun is super janky, so you'll see me. But anyways, so I like to put in this first one at a bit of an angle here, like this. See that? And then what I do, once I get the first staple in, I like to trim the neoprene rubber, try and eyeball where I think it'll get one full loop around. And then I'll check it and I'll see, so this almost always happens. So you see here, it's actually too much. It's overlapping itself, so I still need to trim a little bit more off. Now that I've trimmed, there we go. Now it's laying. That'll be perfect. So now I lay it in position here, and now I want a staple to go here and here. So I'm gonna get that first staple in, and now I just go around on this bias. Awesome. Okay, and then I use my 1, 2, 3 block to kind of press them in, press everything in flat, press all those staples in nice and flush. There we go. There's our mid knot. Now, for the heel knot. So the mid knot, this is cut to a 1/2 inch thickness, or a 1/2 inch width rather. This is cut to 1 3/16 inch width. That's just the length that I have found works well for me. Now this one, I've only trimmed what's going to be the bottom of the heel just a little bit, or rather the handle part. I'll show you here in a second. So for this one, I like to, first off, I'm going to trim this so that this is going to be the outside. So I'm gonna, so I'm gonna trim it so that it has an angle. Can you see that angle there? So trimmed it so that there's an angle so that when I wrap this around, it'll meet with itself more evenly. It'll make sense when you work with it more. I hope that makes sense. So here's the shaved portion. Here's the whip. It's gonna lay on like this. So the shaved portion is down here, and this portion is flat. This is where our concho is gonna go. Now I like to lay this so that there's just a little bit, like a millimeter from the top of the heel up a millimeter, the top of the accent knot material. So you see that? That's kind of what I'm looking for. Okay, take my stapler, place it, and just like before, once we get our first staple in, I'm gonna trim it where I think it's gonna line up with itself here. And let's see. And as per usual, it's a little bit too much. It's kind of overlapping itself. So I'm gonna, there we go. That looks good. So now what I'm going to do is kind of squeeze it in together like this. Boom. Ah. Oh, this is kind of exhausting on the hands. So that next staple kind of holds it in place like that. Now I'm going to do the bottom one here, which will kind of look like this. Boom. See what we're doing here? And then I'll seal it up in the middle and on the side. Now we've got this going for us. And then I just like to do this shape. Here, let me show you. And then I do kind of this pattern. So I'll do that, and then I'll do this pattern around the rest of it. And then I'll take my 1, 2, 3 block, make it flush to itself. Okay, now we need to put on our concho. So you'll see here, there's like this V. Can you see this here? Come on, focus. Focus. There we go. There's this V here at the top. Well, this is where the epoxy is gonna go to stick our concho onto our heel. And epoxy can sneak through this section here. So what I need to do is wrap it with a little bit of athletic tape so that that epoxy won't escape. Just kind of giving it one wrap over. And we'll wrap it more before we put on our accent knots. So this is just a couple passes. All right. So for our concho, you're going to need vinyl tape, a paper towel, your epoxy, your concho, and I'm going to decide, I'm going to do Celtic silver for this one. And then I have, so conchos have this rivet on the back of it, and every concho comes with this screw that you can then screw the concho onto leather with. You poke a hole in the leather, you stick the concho in there, and you screw it into place from the back side. That's not how we use this though. We're just gonna epoxy it. So I have these metal trimmers that are flat on the top, and I'm gonna trim off that back piece here. So I kind of like just on the very corner of this trimmer, I kind of squish it a little bit, trimming it in, kind of like you're, I don't know, chopping a tree or something. As we go around, trying to get this back portion as flush as possible. There we go. And now you can see that protrusion comes out much less than it did. I'm gonna set that there on our paper towel, and we need to we're gonna move pretty quickly here once we get started because this epoxy is kind of messy stuff. So what I'm gonna do is have two, like, I don't know, 3-inch long pieces. No, this is like 5 inches. 2 5-inch long pieces of vinyl tape, and then one like 7 or 8-inch piece of vinyl tape. I seal my old containers of epoxy with this hex wrench from probably an IKEA piece of furniture or something. And going to get a little bulge of epoxy here, about that much. Trying not to make a mess because epoxy is really gross to get off your fingers. And then I'm going to place the concho, press it down a little bit, and you're going to see the excess epoxy is going to come out of the edges. So I'm going to do this first wipe down, and the way that I do this is I kind of go in a circular motion, trying to, I've done that better before. Okay. And now there's less excess and it's a little bit easier to work with. Okay, so how do I do this? So how do I line up the concho the way that I want it? So here's the herringbone. So I want to line up this kind of cross shape of the Celtic concho with that herringbone. So I eyeball it and I see where it lines up there. So I don't know if you can see that, but top of the cross, herringbone. So they're pretty well lined up here. And then I'll give it another press to get the excess, try and get as much of the excess out of the way. We're gonna take our first of our two shorter pieces of tape here. And I like to find the low spot of where the concho is setting. So I don't know if you can see, but it's kind of tilted like this right now. So I will place this on the lowest spot. And then when I wrap it around on the other side, then I can kind of snug it down. So the concho was like this, and then I pull it and it's kind of in position there. Give it another tug down here. And then I'll wipe it down some more. And then I'll take my second piece of shorter tape and wrap that around. And then I just kind of fiddle with them, pulling down on each side until it's like as flat as I can kind of eyeball it. This one can come down a little bit further. There we go. And then I hold them all in place once it's where I want it. And I take this last piece and I really tightly wrap around. Whew. We did a lot of work so far on this whip. And this last part, the accent knots, they are not easy. But don't worry. I'm gonna walk you through it best as I can. You just have to set this somewhere safe. I like to let it set for at least 24 hours, ideally 48 hours. This epoxy can take a while. So put this somewhere safe for at least 24 hours, and then we'll tie our accent knots. See you in a bit. We did it. We've completed all of the plaiting in our Bullwhip. Now, I've got mine hanging here, and I'm very excited in a couple days when that epoxy dries to get those accent knots on there and to see this thing really come together. So I'll be going over those accent knots in the next and final video in the How to Make a Bullwhip series. If you have any questions about anything we went over in this video, please feel free to comment down below. I'm gonna try to get to as many of those questions as possible. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like, and if you'd like more whip-related content, feel free to subscribe. And as always, happy cracking.